Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome everyone here this evening and those at home, the audience at home watching, that we'll be inviting everyone to the 2019 Haverford Township Reorganization meeting. Before I start, again, I would like to remind everyone in the audience that this meeting is being recorded and is being broadcasted live. So at this time, I will call the roll. Mr. D'Amelio?
Here.
Mr. Oliva?
Here.
Mr. McCluskey?
Here.
Mr. Siegel?
Here. Here.
Mr. Holmes?
Here.
Mr. McGarity?
Here.
Dr. Hart?
Here.
And Mr. Wexler?
Here.
You all stand. Chief, you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands,
one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Alrighty, before I proceed, I would just like to make, again, my name is Larry Gentili. I'm the Township Manager. I'll just be, for a very brief period, be chairing this meeting. I'll be taking nominations. But before that, I would just like to make a statement on behalf of the Township staff, myself, to personally thank the Board of Commissioners and their families for all the time and dedication that you provide to this community and the leadership that you provide to me and the staff. Over the last year, we've accomplished many great things. This is a little bit over more than their first year in this beautiful building here. Haverford Township is definitely a better place for our communities to raise our families, and I sincerely appreciate all the support and dedication that this board has provided me and the staff, so thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. Holmes, you
Said you're welcome.
Thank you. At this time, I'll be accepting nominations for the President of the Board of Commissioners for the year of 2019.
Mr. Gentili,
Yes, Mr.
I'd like to make a motion to nominate Andy Lewis to serve as President of the Board of Commissioners.
I'd like to second that nomination.
I'm sorry, who seconded that, Mario?
I did.
Close the nominations.
Okay. Okay, no other nominations. All in favor to close the nominations?
Aye.
Any opposed? And none opposed? I'll be taking the roll. Mr. D'Amelio?
Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Oliva?
Andy Lewis.
Mr. McCluskey?
Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Siegel?
I vote present.
Mr. Lewis?
Andy Lewis.
Mr. Holmes?
Commissioner Lewis.
Mr. McGarity?
Andy Lewis.
And Dr. Hart?
Mr. Lewis.
And Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Lewis.
Congratulations, Mr. Lewis. We'll just real quick, you can just flip the whole computer right over there.
I'm so sorry. I'll grab that for you.
Sure.
Is that mine? Yeah. In there and plug it in so it doesn't go dead on me. Larry, you got that? I will.
I just want to first thank my colleagues for their support. I appreciate it very much. It's a privilege to serve. I can assure you that I will continue as I have in the past, and I think this board has as well, to work in a bipartisan way to find common ground and get outcomes and solutions that are in the best interests of our residents and taxpayers first and foremost. That's what we were elected to do. I think that's what this board has done in the past, and I have every confidence we'll do that in the future. So thank you for your support. Also want to thank Commissioner Wexler for his service as our president last year, for his exceptional leadership and service. Thank you, Bill. Appreciate it very much. And with those comments, I'd like to now turn our attention to the first item, or third item on the agenda, which is the nomination for Vice President of the Board of Commissioners. Entertain a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to nominate Mr. Wexler for Vice President of the Board of Commissioners.
Mr. Wexler has not been nominated. Is there a second?
I second the nomination.
Okay. Any other nominations?
President, I make a motion to nominate Larry Holmes to serve as Vice President.
Second.
Second by Mr. D'Amelio. Are there any other nominations? Entertain a motion to close nominations.
Nominations.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? If you could, to state your preference between Mr. Wexler and Mr. Holmes when Larry calls the roll. Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio?
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Oliva?
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. McCluskey?
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Siegel?
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Lewis?
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Holmes?
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. McGarity?
Mr. Wexler.
Dr. Hart?
Mr. Holmes.
And Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Holmes.
Congratulations, Mr. Wexler.
Congratulations, Mr. Holmes.
Don't have to move anymore.
That's good.
Thank you again to my board members for affording me this opportunity. I promise to serve faithfully as Vice President of the Board.
Okay, we'll turn our attention now to it's item number 4 on the agenda. We have 3 administrative appointments to make, the first of which is Township Solicitor, and there is a typo here. This is a term, a one-year term expiring December 31st, 2019, not 2010. So entertain a motion for Township Solicitor.
Mr. President,
Yes.
motion to reappoint James Byrne and the firm McNichol Byrne Milowski as Township Solicitor.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. McGarity. Are there any other nominations?
Motion to close?
Motion to close. Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes carry. Please call the roll.
D'Amelio? Mr. Oliva?
Jim Byrne.
Mr. McCluskey?
Mr. Byrne.
Mr. Siegel?
Mr. Byrne.
Mr. McGarity?
Jim Byrne. He's coming down to me.
What is it?
Yep, we're going by you'll be the last one.
No, I get to.
Dr. Hart?
Mr. Byrne.
Mr. Wexler?
Mr. Byrne.
And Mr. Holmes?
McNichol, Byrne, Medlowski, and Mr. Byrne.
And Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Byrne. Congratulations, Jim.
Now you can get paid.
The next administrative appointment is Civil Service Solicitor.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Mr. D'Amelio.
I'd like to make a motion to reappoint Kevin O'Neill, Civil Service Commission Solicitor for one-year term to expire December 31st, 2019.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Oliva. Are there any other nominations?
Motion to close the
A
nominations.
second to close? Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes carry. Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio?
Mr. O'Neill.
Mr. Oliva?
Mr. O'Neill.
Mr. McCluskey?
Mr. O'Neill.
Mr. Siegel?
Mr. O'Neill.
McGarity?
Kevin O'Neill.
Dr. Hart?
Mr. O'Neill.
Mr. Wexler?
Mr. O'Neill.
Mr. Holmes?
Mr. O'Neill.
And Mr. Lewis.
Mr. O'Neill. Congratulations to Mr. O'Neill. I don't think he's here this evening, but congratulations to him on his reappointment. Okay, the next item is the Township Engineer, and I would maybe ask Larry to make a comment here, and as this is your recommendation.
Certainly, as this board knows, that Mr. Pannoni has done outstanding things for Haverford Township, works great with our staff, and I would give him my whole support and recommendation that this board would consider reappointing Mr. Pannoni's firm to another year to expire December 31st of 2019.
Mr. President, I make a motion to confirm the Township Manager's reappointment of Pannoni Engineers as Township Engineer to expire December 31st, 2019.
I second it.
Moved by Mr. Wexler, second by Mr. McGarity. Please, there's no necessity to close nomination. This is the manager's appointment, so please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Pannoni Associates.
Mr. Oliva.
Pannoni?
Mr. McCluskey.
Pannoni Engineers.
Mr. Siegel.
Pannoni Engineers.
Mr. McGarity.
Pannoni Engineers.
Dr. Hart.
Pannoni Engineers.
Mr. Wexler.
Pannoni Engineers.
Mr. Holmes.
Pannoni Engineers.
And Mr. Lewis.
Pannoni and Associates. Congratulations, Dave. Next, item number 5, Resolution 1212-2019. This is authorizing appointments to the various boards and commissions.
Mr. President,
Yes, Mr.
to adopt Resolution Number 2112, 2019, appointing the following boards and commissions.
Second.
Second by Mr. D'Amelio. So we'll just take a voice vote here. All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Ayes carry. Thank you. Now we turn to the appointments. I would just like to preface this, this part of the meeting by saying that we had, like we had in years past, unfortunately I couldn't attend this year's interviews. I did attend the interviews the 2 years prior, and we continue to have exceptional candidates that have applied for these various boards and commissions. People that are willing to step forward and offer their talents and volunteer. So it's reflective of the community that we live in. So I thank those that have stepped forward to give up their time, and we did have a lot of good talent. So in some cases it was a coin toss, and the candidates were indistinguishable. They were so strong. So I would encourage those that do not get appointed this evening to reconsider and reapply again in the future. So with that, the preface, we'll start with the first appointment, which is the Cable TV Board, Advisory Board for a 4-year term. I don't think we had any candidates for this position, so unless someone on the board has someone to nominate, I would suggest that we table this.
Motion to table?
Second.
Second. All in favor to table?
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes carry. So we'll advertise this position. Gloria, we'll do that in the morning, I assume, on the website. And then I would also suggest that the commissioners that have email distribution list, that they get the word out about this vacancy, this opportunity to serve on the Cable TV Board. And we'd appreciate you doing that. And hopefully we can fill this position in February. Next is the Environmental Advisory Committee. This is a 2-year term to expire December 31st, 2020. This is an acute committee that's been very active and a great resource to this board and to this township, and helping us, kind of guiding us along the way to do our role as environmental stewards. And they've had a lot of great suggestions and that we've adopted as a township. So we thank them for their service, and each ward commissioner gets to make an individual appointment. So we'll start with Commissioner D'Amelio in Ward 1.
Larry Watkins.
Did you get that, Larry?
No, I did not. I'm
Sorry, would you repeat that?
Larry Watkins.
Thank you.
Ward 2, Commissioner Oliva.
Dave Schwartz?
Can you hear me now?
Ward 3, Commissioner McCluskey.
Amy Colleen.
Yeah.
Commissioner 4, Dan Siegel.
I'll defer this till next week.
Okay, thank you.
Confirm.
Commissioner McGarity in Ward 7.
Henry Eichman.
Sorry, what was the name?
Henry Eichman, E-I-C-H-M-A-N.
Commissioner Hart in Ward 8.
Peter Pugliese.
And Commissioner Wexler in Ward 9.
Shalumer.
And Commissioner Holmes in Ward 6.
Mr. President, I'm going to defer mine for a week.
Okay? And I would like to reappoint Victor Barsky. Next is the Friends of the Grange. We have 3 appointments for one-year terms. And I'll entertain a motion for the first appointment.
Mr. President, I would like to make a motion to nominate Chad Brooks.
Mr. Brooks has been nominated. Is there a second?
Second.
Second. Mr. McGarity. Are there any other nominations? I have a motion to close.
Close.
I have a second. Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Ayes carry. Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Mr. Brooks.
Mr. Oliva.
Mr. Brooks.
McCluskey.
Mr. Brooks.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Brooks.
McGarity.
Mr. Grange, Brooks.
Dr.
Chad
Hart.
Brooks, I'm sorry.
Mr. Brooks.
Chad Brooks, whatever.
Brooks, same thing.
Dr. Hart.
Mr. Brooks.
And Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Brooks.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Brooks.
And Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Brooks. We have another second appointment for a one-year term. Entertain a motion.
Caitlin Piazza.
Caitlin, Commissioner Hart has nominated Caitlin Piazza.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Wexler. Are there any other nominations?
Well, there's another appointment too to this, right?
We have one more opening.
Okay.
Can I have a motion to close?
Motion to close.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes carry. Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Piazza.
Mr. Oliva.
Ms. Piazza.
Mr. McCluskey.
Ms. Piazza.
Mr. Siegel.
Ms. Piazza.
Mr. McGarity, I'm sorry.
Piazza.
Dr. Hart.
Ms. Piazza.
Mr. Wexler.
Ms. Piazza.
Mr. Holmes.
Ms. Piazza.
And Mr. Lewis.
Ms. Piazza. And our third and final appointment to the Friends of the Grange.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to appoint Tim Weisman to serve on the Friends of the Grange for a term of 1 year to expire December 31st, 2019.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Oliva. Any other nominations?
Motion to close.
Seconded.
Second.
Second, all in favor of closing nominations?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes carry. Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Mr. Weissman.
Mr. Oliva.
Mr. Weissman.
Mr. McCluskey.
Mr. Weissman.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Weitzman.
Mr. McGarity.
Mr. Weisman.
Dr. Hart.
Mr. Weissman.
Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Weissman.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Weissman.
And Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Weissman. Congratulations to Mr. Weissman and to Chad Brooks and to Caitlin Piazza for their one reappointment and 2 new appointments to the Grange. Thank you for stepping forward and volunteering to serve. We'll now turn to the Health Advisory Board, which is a 5-year term ending on December 31st, 2023.
President,
Yes,
motion to appoint Dr. Kenneth Simbiri to the Health Advisory Board.
Second. Sorry.
seconded by Mr. Holmes.
Is that open?
Yes, there's one open position.
There's one open. It is open.
It's open?
It's a 9-member board now, yeah, so it's not, it's,
Okay, all
it
right.
is open.
Confusion earlier on whether it
Yeah.
was open or not.
Motion to close.
Motion to close. I have a second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
I'm sorry, what's his last name?
Simbiri.
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 Sabiri, Dr. Sabiri.
Okay. Mr. Oliva.
Dr. Sabiri?
McCluskey.
Dr. Sabiri.
Mr. Siegel.
Dr. Simbiri.
McGarity.
Dr. Sabiri.
Dr. Hart.
Dr. Sabiri.
Wexler.
Dr. Simbiri.
Mr. Holmes.
Dr. Simbiri.
And Mr. Lewis.
Dr. Simbiri. Congratulations, Dr. Simbiri. We have, next up is the Historical Commission, 4-year term. We have three openings on the Historical Commission. Each is a 4-year term expiring December 31st, 2022. Entertain a motion for the first appointment.
Mr. President,
Yes, Mr.
I'd like to appoint Kathy Case to serve on the Historic Commission for a 4-year term to expire on December 31st, 2022.
Second.
Are there any other nominations?
Motion to close.
I have a second to close. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes carry. Please call the roll.
D'Amelio.
This case.
Mr. Oliva.
Got the case?
McCluskey.
This case. This case.
Mr. Siegel.
This case.
Mr. McGarity.
Kathy Case.
Dr. Hart.
This case.
Mr. Wexler.
This case.
Mr. Holmes.
This case.
And Mr. Lewis.
Kathy Case. So for the second four-year term,
Mr. President,
yes, Mr. Oliva.
make a motion to appoint Matthew Roy to serve on the Historic Commission for a 4-year term to expire on December 31st, 2022.
Second. Oh, go ahead.
Seconded by Mr. D'Amelio.
Motion to close.
Motion to close, been seconded, I'm sorry,
Who is this?
Matthew Roy. He applied for the library and also the historical.
Oh, okay.
It's been moved and seconded to close.
Yes.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Ayes carry. Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Roy.
Mr. Oliva.
Mr. Roy.
McCluskey.
Mr. Roy.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Roy.
McGarity.
Mr. Roy.
Dr. Hart.
Mr. Roy.
Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Roy.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Roy.
And Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Wright. And the third and final one is an appointment. Actually, there's a requirement that a representative from the Planning Commission sit on the Historical Commission as well. And that was Chuck Reardon, and he has stepped down from that position. And Jesse Poynton, who serves on the Planning Commission, has agreed to replace Mr. Reardon as the liaison from the Planning Commission to the Historical Commission. So I'd entertain a motion to
Mr. President,
appoint Jesse
So
Poynton.
moved. Sorry.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
you want to know who that is?
Jesse Poynton. Sorry.
Oh, he had said it. I'm sorry.
Oh, I didn't hear it.
Yeah, no, it's okay. He said in particular, Mr. Poynton.
Appointment.
Mr. Oliva.
Mr. Pointman.
And Mr. McCluskey.
Appointment.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Poynton.
Mr. McGarity.
Mr. Poynton.
Dr. Hart.
Mr. Poynton.
Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Poynton.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Poynton.
And Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Poynton. Next on the agenda is Human Relations Commission. We have three-year terms expiring December 31st, 2021. And we had just a wealth of candidates that stepped forward for these positions. So
Mr. President.
entertain a motion for the first position.
Mr. President, I would like to reappoint Jen Leith to serve on the Human Relations Commission for a 3-year term to expire December 31, 2021.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. D'Amelio. Any other nominations?
Motion to close.
Motion to close. I have a second.
Second.
All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes carry. Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Ken Leith.
Mr. Oliva.
Jen Leith.
Mr. McCluskey.
Jen Leith.
Mr. Siegel.
Ms. Leith.
Mr. McGarity.
Danley's.
Dr. Hart.
Ms. Leith.
Mr. Wexler.
Ms. Leith.
Mr. Holmes.
Ms. Leith.
And Mr. Lewis.
Jen Leith.
Mr. President, I'd like to make a motion to appoint Kathy Dawson to serve on the Human Relations Commission for a 3-year term.
Second?
Seconded by Mr. Oliva. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. Are there any other nominations?
Motion to close.
Motion to close. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second to close. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes carry. Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Kathy Dawson.
Mr. Oliva.
Ms. Dawson.
Mr. McCluskey.
Ms. Dawson.
Mr. Siegel.
Ms. Dawson.
McGarity.
Dawson.
Dr. Hart.
Ms. Dawson.
Mr. Wexler.
Ms. Dawson.
Mr. Holmes.
Ms. Dawson.
And Mr. Lewis.
Ms. Dawson.
Mr. Chairman,
Third and final appointment?
I'd like to
Mr. McGarry.
appoint Sean Gallagher to serve on the Human Relations Commission for a 3-year term to expire December 31st, 2021.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. D'Amelio.
Mr. President, I'd like to make a motion to appoint Kalila Mays to serve on the Human Relations Commission for a 3-year term to expire December 31st, 2021.
We have a second.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Siegel. Any other nominations?
Motion to close.
Motion to close. Okay, so we have Mr. Gallagher and Ms. Mays have been moved and seconded for consideration. And the nomination are closed, so please state your vote when Mr. Gentili calls the roll.
Okay, Mr. D'Amelio.
Gallagher.
Mr. Oliva.
Mr. Gallagher.
Mr. McCluskey.
Ms. Mays.
Mr. Siegel.
Ms. Mays.
Mr. McGarity.
Sean Gallagher.
Dr. Hart.
Ms. Mays.
Mr. Wexler.
Ms. Mays.
Mr. Holmes.
Ms. Mays.
And Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Gallagher. It's a 5-4 vote for Ms. Mays. Is that correct, Larry?
Yes.
So congratulations to Jen Leith, Kathy Dawson, and Kalila Mays, who will be serving on the Human Relations Commission. Next is the Ice Skating Rink Advisory Board, 3-year term. We have 5 appointments to make.
Chairman,
Yes, Mr.
make a motion
There
to
you
reappoint Drew Sincox to serve on the Ice Skating Rink Advisory Board for a term of 3 years to expire December 31st, 2021.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. McGarity. Any other nominations?
Close the nominations?
Second to close.
Second.
Seconded. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes carried. Please call the roll.
Emilio.
Mr. Simcox.
Mr. Oliva.
Mr. Simcox.
Mr. McCluskey.
Mr. Simcox.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Simcox.
Mr. McGarity.
Simcox, Mr. Simcox.
Dr. Hart.
Mr. Simcox.
Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Simcox.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Simcox.
And Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Simcox. The second 3-year appointment?
Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. Holmes.
Mr. President, I'd like to reappoint Rich Caesar to the Ice Skating Rink Advisory Board.
Second?
Seconded by Mr. Oliva. Any other nominations?
Motion to close?
Motion to close. Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Mr. Caesar.
Mr. Oliva.
Mr. Caesar.
Mr. McCluskey.
Mr. Caesar.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Caesar.
McGarity.
Cena, Mr. Cena.
Dr. Hart.
Mr. Caesar.
Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Caesar.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Caesar.
And Mr. Lewis.
Rich Caesar. Our third appointment?
Mr. President,
Yes, Mr. Siegel.
motion to appoint Eric Tesarchik to the Ice Rink Advisory Board.
Second?
Seconded by Mr. Oliva. Any other nominations?
Motion to close.
Motion to close and a second.
Second.
All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes carry. Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Oh, Eric,
Hazard.
Zarzik.
sorry.
And Mr. Oliva.
Yeah, Eric.
Good idea.
Go with Eric.
Mr. McCluskey.
Mr. Tarchik.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Tesarchik.
McGarity.
I'm with Eric.
Dr. Hart.
Mr. Tesarchik.
Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Tesarchik.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Tesarchik.
And Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Zarzak.
Kind of like a hockey player's name.
Yeah.
It's like Pisarchik from the Giants.
Garzik.
with a T.
Okay, our fourth appointment.
President, I'd like to make a motion to appoint Victor Cortese to the Ice Rink Advisory Board.
Victor, I'm sorry. Hold on one second. I'm sorry.
Got it.
Cortese, C-O-R.
C-O-R.
T-E-S-E.
C.
Victor Cortese.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Siegel. Are there any other nominations?
Motion to
Motion to
Close.
close. Have a second to close? Do I have a second to close?
Second.
Second. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Any opposed? Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Mr. Cortese.
Mr. Oliva.
Victor Cortese.
Mr. McCluskey.
Mr. Cortese.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Cortese.
Mr. McGarity.
Mr. Fertati.
Dr. Hart.
Mr. Cortese.
Wexler.
Mr. Cortese.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Cortese.
And Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Cortese. Our fifth and final,
Mr. President, I'd like to make
Yes.
a motion to appoint Jeremy Beha,
I think it's Beha. I
or
think,
Beha,
yes.
I'll second that.
Motion to close.
Do I have a second to close? All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Any opposed? Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Mr. Bayhat.
Mr. Oliva.
Mr. Beha.
McCluskey.
Jeremy Beha.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Beha.
McGarity.
Mr. Bayhat.
Dr. Hart.
Mr. Beha.
Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Beha.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Beha.
And Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Beha. Congratulations to all those that are been either reappointed or appointed to the Ice Skating Rink Advisory Board. Next is the Library Board of Trustees. We have 3 positions, all expiring, 3-year term expiring December 31st, 2021. Mr. Siegel.
Motion to reappoint Phil Goldsmith to the Library Board.
Second?
Seconded by Mr. Oliva.
Motion to close.
Second?
Second to close. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes, carried. Please call the roll.
D'Amelio.
Bill Goldsmith.
Mr. Oliva.
Bill Goldschmidt.
Mr. McCluskey.
Mr. Goldsmith.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Goldsmith.
McGarity.
Mr. Goldsmith.
Dr. Hart.
Mr. Goldsmith.
Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Goldsmith.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Goldsmith.
And Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Goldsmith. The second opening,
President, I make a
Yes.
motion to reappoint Madeline Ofria to serve on the Library Board of Trustees for a term of 3 years to expire on December 31st, 2021.
second. Seconded by, I'm sorry,
Aye.
Mr. Oliva. Are there any other nominations?
Motion to close.
Motion closed. Do I have a second? All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes, carry. Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Madeline Ofria.
Mr. Oliva.
Madeline Ofria.
Mr. McCluskey.
Ms. Ofria.
Mr. Siegel.
Ms. Ofria.
Mr. McGarity.
Ms. Ofria.
Dr. Hart.
Ms. Ofria.
Mr. Wexler.
Ms. Ofria.
And Mr. Holmes.
Ms. Ofria.
And Mr. Lewis.
Madeline Ofria.
Mr. President, I make
Yes,
a motion to
Mr.
appoint
Wexler.
Deborah Sella to serve on the Library Board of Trustees for a term of 3 years to expire on December 31st, 2021.
Second?
Seconded by Mr. D'Amelio.
Motion to close.
Motion to close, a second to close? Seconded. All in favor of closing? Any
Aye.
opposed? Ayes, carry. Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Sullivan.
Mr. Oliva.
Deborah Sella?
Mr. McCluskey.
Ms. Sella.
Mr. Siegel.
Ms. Sella.
Mr. McGarity.
Deborah Sullivan.
Dr. Hart.
Ms. Sella.
Mr. Wexler.
Ms. Sella.
Mr. Holmes.
Ms. Sella.
And Mr. Lewis.
Debbie Sella. Thank you very much, and thank you for those 3 to step forward to serve on the library board. And next we turn to Parks and Rec. We have 2 positions. One is a 5-year term expiring December 31st, 2023, and then 1 position to fill an unexpired term, which is basically a 1-year term expiring December 31st, 2019. So we'll do the first one, which is a 5-year term. Entertain a motion. Yes, Mr.
I'd like to appoint Joe Heller to serve on the Parks and Rec Board for a term of 5 years to expire on December 31st, 2023.
I have a second.
Second.
Second by Mr. Siegel. Any other nominations?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to nominate Steve Cole.
Mr. Cole's been nominated. Do I have a second?
Second?
Seconded by Commissioner Wexler. Are there any other nominations? Have a motion to close?
Motion to close.
Second?
Second. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes, carry. Please state your preference or your vote between Mr. Heller or Mr. Cole. And Larry calls the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Mr. Cole.
Mr. Oliva.
Mr. Heller.
I'm sure you said Mrs. Heller?
Mr. Heller.
Mr. Heller.
Joe Heller.
Joe Heller. Mr. McCluskey.
Mr. Heller.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Heller.
Mr. McGarity.
Mr. Heller.
Dr. Hart.
Mr. Heller.
Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Cole?
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Cull.
And Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Cole.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have 5 Hellers and,
Correct.
5 Hellers and 4 Cole. Mr. Heller has been appointed to a 5-year term on the Parks and Rec Board, and now we'll turn our attention to the second appointment, which is effectively a 1-year term.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to elect Mr. Cole to fill an unexpired 1-year, right, term?
Unexpired
Term,
5, it's an unexpired 5-year term to expire at the end of this year.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Oliva. Are there any other nominations?
Motion to close.
Been moved to close. Do I have a second to close?
Nominate Jamie Jolosian.
Okay, Jamie Gelosian has been nominated. Do we have a second?
Steve motioned to close, and I seconded that.
He tried to interrupt.
He was trying to get in. He was trying to get, yeah.
Then
So, anyway,
procedurally, I should withdraw my motion to close.
yeah, if you wouldn't mind, thank you.
And I withdraw
Thank you.
myself?
Yeah, I could see Dr. Hart was ready to nominate before we, so. The first one is Steve Cole.
Steve Cole.
Second one is Jamie Gelosian. So do we have it was moved for for Jamie Gelosian. I think that's the right pronunciation. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that properly. Do we have a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. McCluskey. Okay, are any other nominations? Have a motion to close?
Motion to close.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes, carry. Please state your vote between Mr. Call and Mr. Jamie Gelosian.
Jamie's a woman.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Mr. Cole.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Woman.
Female, I'm sorry.
Mr.
Mr.
Oliva.
Gelosian.
Mr. Cull.
Mr. McCluskey.
Ms. Gelosian.
Mr. Siegel.
Ms. Gelosian.
Mr. McGarity.
Mr. Cole.
Dr. Hart.
Ms. Jolosian.
Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Cull.
Mr. Holmes.
Ms. Jolosian.
And Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Cole.
Cole has 5 votes.
I'm sorry.
I have Mr. Cole as 5 votes.
5 votes for Mr. Cole. So Mr. Cole will fill the unexpired 5-year term. Congratulations to Mr. Heller and Mr. Cole. Now we turn our attention to the Planning Commission. We have one opening on the Planning Commission for a 4-year term expiring December 31st, 2022.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to reappoint Mr. Angelo Capuzzi to serve on the Planning Commission for a term of 4 years to expire December 31st, 2022.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. D'Amelio. Any other nominations?
Motion to close?
Motion to close. Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes, carry. Please call the roll.
D'Amelio.
Mr. Capuzzi.
Mr. Oliva.
Mr. Capuzzi.
Mr. McCluskey.
Mr. Capuzzi.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Capuzzi.
McGarity.
Mr. Capuzzi.
Dr. Hart.
Mr. Capuzzi.
Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Capuzzi.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Capuzzi.
And Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Capuzzi. Congratulations to Mr. Capuzzi, who's done an outstanding job on the Planning Commission. He's been on there for some time, but he's been a great asset to that commission. So congratulations to Mr. Capuzzi. Now turning to the RHM Sewer Authority, appointment for a 5-year term.
Mr. President,
Yes, Mr.
I'd like to reappoint Mike Stevens to serve on the RHM Sewer Authority for a 5-year term to expire December 31st, 2023.
Second. Okay.
Seconded by
You get that, Bill?
Mr. Wexler. Mr.
Wexler.
Wexler? Are there any other nominee? I'm sorry, I start.
I'd like to nominate Chris Cahill.
Mr. Cale's been nominated by Commissioner Hart. Is there a second?
Mike Stevens.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Holmes. Commissioner Holmes?
Second person.
So Mike Stevens are there any other nominations? I think there were only two that applied.
Motion to close.
Motion to close.
Second.
Second to close. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes carry, so please state your vote between Mr. Cahill and Mr. Stevens.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Mr. Stevens.
Mr. Oliva.
Mr. Stevens.
McCluskey.
Mr. Stevens.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Cahill.
Mr. McGarity.
Mr. Stevens.
Dr. Hart.
Mr. Cahill.
And Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Stevens.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Cahill.
And Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Stevens.
Mr. Stevens has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
It's a 6-3 vote for Mr. Stevens to be reappointed to the RMH Sewer Authority. We now turn to the Senior Citizens Advisory Council. These are one-year term appointments made by each ward commissioner. Start with Commissioner D'Amelio in Ward 1.
I'll defer mine till the next meeting.
Okay. Mr. Commissioner Oliva.
Jack Doherty.
Commissioner McCluskey.
Patrick Hagan.
Commissioner Siegel.
I'll defer till the next meeting.
Commissioner McGarity.
Rosemary Downs.
Commissioner Hart.
I'll defer to the next meeting.
Commissioner Wexler.
Mr. Robert Lewis.
Commissioner Holmes.
Mr. President, I will defer to the next meeting.
And I'd like to nominate, reappoint Steve Cohen to serve on the Citizens Advisory Council. Next is the Shade Tree Commission. I don't think we had any applicants, but if anybody from the floor, any commissioner has any names, if not, I would entertain a motion to table.
I'll make a motion to table.
Second.
Motion to table has been seconded by Mr. McGarity.
Motion to close.
All in favor of tabling?
Aye.
Any opposed? It's been tabled, and we'll re-advertise that position as well. Next up,
Chairman, I'd
Vacancy Committee for a one-year term.
like to make a motion to appoint Connor Quinn to serve on the Vacancy Committee for a one-year term to expire December 31st, 2019.
Second.
Moved by Mr. McGarity, seconded by Mr. Oliva. Any other nominations? I don't think there are any other applicants. Not entertain a motion to close.
Motion to close.
Second.
Second. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes carry. Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Connor Quinn.
Mr. Oliva.
Mr. Quinn.
Mr. McCluskey.
Mr. Quinn.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Quinn.
Mr. McGarity.
And Mr. Connor Quinn.
Dr. Hart.
Mr. Quinn.
Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Quinn.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Quinn.
And Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Quinn. Next is the Vacancy Property Review Committee, a 5-year term.
Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. Commissioner Oliva.
Brett Bodnar.
Matt Bodnar has been moved.
Second.
Seconded by Commissioner Holmes.
Motion to close.
Motion to close.
Second.
Second to close. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes carry. Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Mr. Bodnar.
Mr. Oliva.
Mr. Bodnar.
Mr. McCluskey.
Bodnar.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Bodnar.
Mr. McGarity.
Mr. Bodnar.
Dr. Hart.
Mr. Bodnar.
Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Bodnar.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Bodnar.
And Mr. Lewis.
Grant Bodnar. Congratulations to Mr. Bodnar, and also congratulations to Connor Quinn. Our Next and last appointment is to the Zoning Hearing Board, a 5-year term to expire December 31st, 2023. Entertain motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to reappoint Mr. Ed Casuli to serve on the Zoning Hearing Board for a term of 5 years to expire December 31st, 2023.
Second.
Moved by Mr. McGarity, second by Mr. Oliva. Do we have any other nominations?
Mr. President.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. President, I move that we appoint Jessica Vitale to serve on the Zoning Hearing Board for a term of 5 years.
Second.
Seconded by Commissioner McCluskey. Are there any other nominations?
Motion to close.
Motion to close. Do I have a second to close?
Second.
All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Any opposed? Please state your preference or your vote between Mr. Casuli and Ms. Vitale.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Mr. Casuli.
Mr. Oliva.
Mr. Casuli.
Mr. McCluskey.
Ms. Vitale.
Mr. Siegel.
Ms. Vitale.
McGarity.
Mr. Casuli.
Dr. Hart.
Ms. Vitale.
Mr. Wexler.
Ms. Vitale.
Mr. Holmes.
With great appreciation to my friend Eddie Casuli, who worked very hard on the zoning board, I cast my vote for Ms. Vitale.
And Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Casuli.
Mr.
5-4.
Tally has 5 votes.
5 votes for Ms. Vitale. Congratulations to her. She'll be a new member of the Zoning Hearing Board, so congratulations to her. I think that concludes our boards and commissions and appointments.
Correct. Yes, it does.
Just want to thank the incumbents that chose either not to seek reelection or who have served in the past. We appreciate it. I know we have one, Monica Bicella, who served as president of the library board, served with great honor and made a big contribution there. We thank her for her service, and there's so many other people that chose not to seek to be reappointed, and we thank them. And we thank those that have stepped forward to serve on the other various boards and commissions. So, does any other commissioner have anything to add? If not, I would just say simply Happy New Year to everybody. Thank you for being here. And I'd entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Have a second? We stand adjourned. Thank you.